He should have died that morning. That's what one anonymous diplomat whispered after the gunfire rattled through Ouagadougou at dawn. At just 36 years old, President Ibrahim Traoré had already made powerful enemies, but few expected an outright assassination attempt. Whispers turned into allegations. Rumors spread that the hit wasn't local. Behind closed doors, foreign operatives panicked, and one name kept resurfacing: Donald Trump. Was it a misunderstanding? A political provocation? Or a covert operation gone wrong? As legal threats loomed and media chaos exploded, Traoré's next words would either ignite a diplomatic war, or reveal a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video. It helps us bring more untold truths to light. Share this with your friends and communities who believe in African sovereignty and justice. And if you want to keep hearing bold voices like Ibrahim Traoré's, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. This channel stands with Africa's future, raw, unfiltered, and fearless. Stay informed. Stay awake. Stay with us. In the days leading up to the assassination attempt, a smear campaign had begun to surface online. Western media outlets, some known for their alignment with conservative U.S. think tanks, began publishing headlines accusing Ibrahim Traoré of authoritarian overreach, anti-Western extremism, and even military corruption. The timing was no coincidence. Traoré had just finalized a sweeping nationalization order targeting foreign-owned mining firms that had long drained Burkina Faso's natural wealth. The message was clear: self-reliance over dependence, sovereignty over submission. Then came the legal threats. A U.S. based political action committee reportedly tied to former President Donald Trump issued a public statement warning of international consequences should Traoré's government continue hostile policies against American interests. Lawyers representing American stakeholders in Burkina Faso's gold sector filed motions in international arbitration courts, accusing Traoré of violating economic treaties. The pressure campaign was mounting, but Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled down. In a televised address, Traoré said, "If defending my people means offending old empires, then so be it." His words electrified the streets of Ouagadougou. But they also painted a target on his back. That target nearly turned fatal. When gunfire erupted near the presidential residence, many were quick to blame radical factions or mercenaries. But Traoré's inner circle hinted otherwise. Leaked intelligence suggested the hit squad carried tech not available to local militias. Ballistic analysis and encrypted communications pointed to training that traced back to foreign soil. The twist wasn't in the attack itself, it was in who didn't speak afterward. For 48 hours, Donald Trump, usually quick to deny or deflect, remained silent. That silence echoed louder than any bullet. And for a continent tired of being puppeteered, it became the ultimate call to wake up. At a regional economic summit in Accra, President Ibrahim Traoré delivered a speech that was never meant to spark international uproar. He spoke boldly about the need for African nations to break free from financial dependencies rooted in colonial legacies. He warned of shadow networks, where former Western leaders, some no longer in power, still influenced African politics through lobbyists, offshore funds, and surveillance contracts. His words were sharp, but not directed at any specific individual. Yet, within hours, the backlash was ferocious. U.S. media interpreted his comments as a direct attack on Donald Trump. Conservative anchors accused Traoré of spreading anti-American disinformation and labeled him a dangerous populist. Trump's legal team issued a statement threatening defamation suits if the reckless and false allegations were not retracted. Calls for sanctions followed. The diplomatic temperature rose rapidly. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the response was completely different. Traoré's speech ignited something deeper. Pan-African networks began sharing his message under the hashtag #UniteOrFall. Leaders from Mali, Guinea, and Chad issued joint statements defending Traoré, arguing that African nations had every right to speak against foreign interference. Protesters in Dakar held signs reading, "We stand with Traoré, Africa first." As Western pressure intensified, so did African resistance. Instead of retracting his words, Traoré responded by unveiling a coalition. A new diplomatic pact among 6 West African nations committed to economic independence, joint defense, and mutual non-aggression. It wasn't just a political move, it was a declaration of unity in the face of global pressure. The twist arrived when a private memo from a European embassy was leaked to the press. It revealed that several intelligence agencies had warned their governments weeks prior about growing African cohesion against Western dominance. Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso, he was speaking for a continent fed up with being divided and exploited. And for the first time, even his enemies began to realize, this wasn't just one man defying the system, it was a movement, rising with one voice. The story began with what seemed like a diplomatic misstep. During an interview with a French-language African news channel, Ibrahim Traoré was asked about Donald Trump's influence in Africa. His reply was measured, but one sentence caused an international uproar. "Africa is not a casino for retired emperors playing with loaded dice." Though he didn't name anyone, many assumed it was a thinly veiled jab at Trump. American media pounced. Editorials labeled Traoré a reckless firebrand. Former Trump aides appeared on conservative talk shows, suggesting the Burkinabe president was aligning with America's enemies. Traoré was accused of inciting hostility against the United States, and a formal warning was issued through diplomatic channels. Legal analysts discussed the possibility of international defamation lawsuits. The misunderstanding escalated when a right-wing lobby group in Washington, with known ties to Trump's inner circle, filed a complaint at the UN Human Rights Council, accusing Traoré of hate speech against Western leaders. The absurdity of the claim was clear, but the political message behind it was loud: stay in line or pay the price. However, Traoré's response was neither apologetic nor reactionary. At the next African Union gathering, he stepped to the podium and delivered a speech now considered historic. He said, "Dignity is not negotiable. When we raise our voices, it's not hatred, it's memory. When we say no, it's not aggression, it's liberation." The room fell silent. Delegates from across the continent rose in applause. It wasn't just about Trump anymore. It was about Africa reclaiming its right to speak without fear. The twist came days later, when internal memos from a European intelligence agency were leaked. They showed that several Western governments had already known Traoré's words were not directed at Trump specifically, but had decided to weaponize the misunderstanding to isolate him diplomatically. The smear campaign was intentional. It was a test, one Traoré passed with defiance and clarity. But the real surprise wasn't Traoré's resilience, it was the domino effect he triggered. Across universities in Africa, students launched forums on post-colonial dignity. Artists painted murals of Traoré as a lion confronting foreign shadows. Even moderate leaders, once hesitant to speak out, began using the word dignity as a political banner. By refusing to apologize for telling the truth, Ibrahim Traoré transformed a campaign of defamation into a continental awakening. His words reminded millions that African dignity is not earned through Western validation, but through the courage to speak without asking permission. The incident began with a press release. A spokesperson from a Washington-based policy institute, closely tied to former U.S. President Donald Trump, published a report accusing Ibrahim Traoré of harboring anti-democratic values, supporting foreign mercenaries, and threatening the geopolitical stability of West Africa. The language was inflammatory, and although it was framed as analysis, it read more like an indictment. Within days, major Western news outlets echoed the report's claims. The New York Herald ran a headline: Traore, the rising strongman of Africa. The implication was clear: Traore was becoming a problem for the Western order. The Burkinabe president, however, refused to stay silent. In a calm but firm response, he held a national broadcast. When the truth is inconvenient, he said, they call it dangerous. When unity threatens their control, they call it radical. He did not attack Trump directly, but the undertones were unmistakable. The message was not just defiance, it was a warning to all forces that sought to divide the continent under the guise of democracy. But the backlash was immediate. A group of American investors in Burkina Faso's telecommunications sector threatened to pull out, claiming the political climate was no longer secure. A conservative U.S. senator publicly called for sanctions against Traore, accusing him of colluding with anti-Western actors. Legal teams connected to former Trump advisors began preparing a defamation case, arguing that Traore's statements incited hostility and endangered American citizens abroad. International observers feared the start of another West versus Africa standoff. But this time, something different happened. African nations didn't remain quiet. One by one, leaders from Mali, Guinea, Niger, and even far-off Namibia issued joint press briefings. They condemned the smear campaign against a sovereign head of state, and accused Western media of reviving colonial-era narratives to justify interference. Then came the twist. A secret diplomatic cable, intercepted and leaked by an anonymous whistleblower, revealed that the original report against Traore had been crafted with direct input from a private advisory firm owned by a former Trump campaign strategist. Worse still, the document suggested that the goal was to pressure Burkina Faso into renegotiating mining rights with a U.S. company recently expelled for environmental violations. What had been framed as a principled concern over democracy was in fact a business move cloaked in politics. When the leak hit African media, outrage erupted. Pan-African networks circulated the story under a single slogan: not one step back. In response, a historic emergency summit was held in Bamako. There, 15 African nations signed a mutual defense and economic cooperation pact. For the first time in decades, African unity wasn't just an ideal, it was policy. Traore stood at the center of it all. Once accused of isolationism, he was now seen as the catalyst for a new era of continental solidarity. The very effort to shame and silence him had unified a fractured region. And Trump, who had once believed he could pull strings behind the scenes, now watched from the sidelines as Africa rose, not as pawns, but as partners standing shoulder to shoulder. The storm began with a tweet. A former U.S. official, who once served as a close advisor to Donald Trump, posted a cryptic message. Africa needs discipline, not defiance. Traore is playing with fire. Within hours, the post went viral. Western pundits interpreted it as a casual observation, but to many Africans, it sounded like a thinly veiled threat, one that reeked of colonial arrogance. The comment triggered a wave of debates across African media. Was this a warning of intervention? Or worse, an admission of orchestrated pressure? Traore's office responded swiftly but diplomatically. A public statement clarified that Burkina Faso would not tolerate external intimidation masquerading as commentary. The response was firm, yet understated. But the Western media didn't back down. In the days that followed, a coordinated smear campaign began to unfold. Major outlets accused Traore of militarizing politics, suppressing Western NGOs, and turning to rogue states for support. The image painted was one of a dictator in the making. Legal action followed. A group of international investors, allegedly influenced by Trump's inner circle, filed a complaint in The Hague, accusing Traore of economic sabotage and xenophobic policy. They demanded reparations for cancelled mining contracts and even floated the idea of freezing Burkina Faso's international reserves. Behind the scenes, private military contractors began circling again, familiar names, familiar tactics. But Traore was already ahead of the game. Weeks earlier, he had quietly hosted a summit in Ouagadougou. No press. No red carpets. Only ministers and economic strategists from Mali, Guinea, and Senegal. The goal? Lay the foundation for a West African financial alliance, complete with a shared development bank, mutual resource ownership, and new trade corridors that bypass traditional Western pipelines. It was not just resistance, it was strategy. When the international complaint became public, Traore delivered a televised address unlike anything seen before. You call our independence sabotage? You call our refusal to be robbed again xenophobia? Then call this what it is, a revolution of self-reliance. He paused, then added, and no, we don't need your permission to breathe. That speech struck a nerve. Not only in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. In Johannesburg, students marched holding signs that read, Traore speaks for us all. In Nairobi, parliament members debated proposing their own economic sovereignty bill. On social media, the slogan #African Self-Reliance trended for days. Then came the twist. A leaked email from a global risk consultancy, contracted by Trump-affiliated firms, revealed they had classified Traore's policies as a threat to Western economic continuity. The document showed that the campaign of lawsuits and media defamation had not been about democracy or human rights, but about stopping the spread of African economic independence. What was intended to isolate Traore ended up elevating him. The continent saw through the lie. And suddenly, what once seemed like a lone president's fight became a continental doctrine: Africa will no longer beg. It will build. And Trump? For once, no lawsuit, no tweet, no billionaire influence could undo what had been set in motion. A silent empire was beginning to fall. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is more than a tale of power struggles or diplomatic tension. It is a lesson about the cost and value of standing firm in a world built on imbalance. When a young leader dares to speak in a voice that isn't approved by global superpowers, he does more than challenge policies, he challenges centuries of inherited arrogance. The lesson here is that independence, no matter how noble, does not come without resistance. And that resistance often wears the disguise of concern, legality, or diplomacy, while hiding a darker intention. Control. Traoré's experience shows how quickly the language of liberation can be weaponized against the liberator. A leader speaks of self-reliance, and he is labeled a radical. He seeks to nationalize resources for his people, and he is branded anti-democratic. He refuses foreign military oversight, and suddenly, he is described as unstable. The lesson is not that one should stay quiet to avoid these labels, it is that these labels are inevitable when you stop obeying. The world order, built on quiet obedience from the global south, reacts violently to any disruption. Another powerful lesson lies in the manipulation of narratives. Western institutions, media, and legal systems have long claimed to uphold justice and objectivity. But Traoré's story proves that these tools can just as easily become weapons when used in defense of economic interests. The false accusations, the legal complaints, the defamation campaigns, all serve as warnings. Truth can be distorted when profit is at stake. What matters is not what is said, but who controls the microphone. This teaches us the importance of building independent media, legal alliances, and intellectual frameworks within Africa and other formerly colonized regions. Yet perhaps the most unexpected lesson is the power of silence. When Traoré was nearly assassinated, and when he suggested that foreign actors may have been behind it, the world waited for denials. But silence came first. That silence spoke louder than any press release. It taught the world to pay attention not just to statements, but to hesitations. In diplomacy and power, what is not said can be more revealing than any speech. That moment exposed how fragile the illusions of innocence can be when the oppressed begin to name their oppressors. A major turning point in this story was not what Traore said, but how Africa responded. The lesson here is the unstoppable momentum of collective dignity. When one nation stands, it is vulnerable. But when many rise together, they become immovable. The African leaders, citizens, students, and even artists who rallied behind Traore did more than express solidarity, they rewrote the narrative. They shifted the spotlight from scandal to sovereignty. And that teaches us that unity is not a slogan, it is a shield. From this, we also learn that legal threats and international sanctions are often less about law and more about intimidation. They function as modern-day chains, disguised as diplomacy. When legal firms tied to powerful Western interests tried to corner Traore, it wasn't justice they were chasing, it was submission. The lesson is clear: true sovereignty will always be tested not in courtrooms, but in how a leader responds to coercion. Traore chose confrontation over compromise, and it reshaped the geopolitical conversation across the continent. But the lesson isn't only political. It's deeply personal. It teaches us the importance of clarity in identity. Traore did not shift his tone to be accepted by the West. He didn't edit his convictions to make peace with former empires. He chose to speak plainly, directly, and with conviction. This is a reminder to all who walk unfamiliar roads: the world may punish your truth, but it will also respect your courage, eventually. And that respect, earned through fire, lasts longer than approval bought with silence. Another lesson, deeply rooted in the African experience, is that trauma does not justify passivity. The continent has been wounded by colonization, slavery, extraction, and manipulation, but those wounds are not excuses to remain silent or submissive. Traore's resistance is a form of healing. By saying no, by demanding ownership, by exposing interference, he opens space for future leaders to act without fear. This shows that every act of defiance becomes a seed for the next generation's freedom. Finally, the story teaches us about legacy. Not just personal legacy, but the legacy of movements. Leaders like Traore are not just heads of state, they are lightning rods. They attract danger, yes, but also energy. They become the figures upon which people project their buried hopes, their silenced dreams, their longing to rise without apology. This is why so many stood with him, not because they agreed with every word, but because he stood when others bowed. His resilience became a reflection of their own hidden strength. In the end, the greatest lesson may be this: the world is not afraid of dictators, it is afraid of the free. Ibrahim Traoré proved that a man with nothing but a backbone and a people's voice can unsettle empires. And through the response to Ibrahim Traoré's actions and the international backlash he faced was overwhelming. Across comment sections and social media platforms, thousands of voices emerged, echoing a deep and widespread sentiment, admiration, solidarity, and a renewed sense of African pride. One of the most liked comments came from a young activist in Accra, who wrote that this was no longer just about one president, it was about a people reclaiming their voice. She described Traoré as the young lion who dared to roar, and thanked the Burkinabe people for showing the rest of the continent what it means to rise without fear. A law student in Nairobi contributed a more analytical perspective. He noted that international law is often weaponized against developing nations under the pretext of human rights and democracy, when in truth it serves to protect foreign financial interests. He pointed out the hypocrisy of calling out Traoré for protecting national resources while ignoring decades of Western interference in Africa's internal affairs. For him, this story wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was a case study in how power reacts when it starts to lose control. The anger was also palpable. One viewer, responding to U.S. media accusations against Traore, wrote bluntly that Trump and his allies had no right to dictate African affairs after centuries of exploitation. That single statement ignited a firestorm of replies, many agreeing that this was part of a much larger pattern of neo-colonial behavior disguised as diplomacy. Several users pointed out how the West only seems interested in African democracy when its business interests are threatened. From Chicago, an African-American viewer expressed something more personal. She shared how watching Traore reminded her of the suppressed voices within her own country. She admitted she hadn't known much about Burkina Faso before, but now she was reading every article she could find. To her, Traore was not just a national leader, he was a symbol of black resistance everywhere. A few comments, however, struck a more cautious tone. A user from Paris emphasized that while Traore's courage was admirable, no leader should be idolized blindly. He called for accountability and balance, reminding viewers that every leader must be questioned. Still, even he admitted that the Western media's treatment of Traore felt unfair and suspiciously coordinated. Another user replied, arguing that while no one is above criticism, context matters. When a leader defends his people's resources and sovereignty, and is punished for it, then that criticism becomes part of the problem. Content creators from across Africa chimed in. A YouTuber based in South Africa pinned a comment stating that Traore represented a generational shift. For too long, Africa's youth had been told to compromise, to wait, to be realistic. But here was a man who defied those limits, who faced global pressure without flinching. According to him, if this story didn't awaken the continent, then nothing would. Voices from outside Africa also weighed in. A user from London, not African himself, said he admired what Traore was doing. He argued that any leader who makes the rich and powerful uncomfortable is probably doing something right. From Sao Paulo, a viewer in Brazil expressed solidarity, drawing connections between Africa's struggle for economic independence and the battles fought by Latin American nations against U.S. influence and corporate imperialism. He ended his comment with the words, "Our pain is shared, but so is our power." Not all comments were loud or political. One user simply wrote that she cried when she saw Traore speak, not out of sadness but from remembering her grandfather's stories of colonization. He never lived to see a leader like this, she said, but maybe his grandchildren would grow up in a freer world. Among the thousands of remarks, one quote stood out and was repeated again and again: "Africa is not a casino for retired emperors playing with loaded dice." Some called it the quote of the century. Others said it would become a rallying cry for a new Pan-African era. A user from Lagos delivered a sobering reminder: inspiration alone is not enough. He said, "Let's stop clapping. Let's start building. We need schools, roads, and jobs." Words are powerful, but only action will truly free us. Still, even he admitted that Traore had sparked something real, and that spark was spreading. And finally, buried among thousands of comments, one message captured the mood perfectly: they tried to silence him. They tried to shame him. They even tried to kill him. But he stood taller than ever. And now, we stand too. That line wasn't liked or shared as much as the others. But it didn't need to be. It rang true, in quiet power, like the man it honored.